This video is going to introduce you to the 6 kingdoms on a cellular level. You may have learned about 5 kingdoms before. So one of the great things about biology is that as we learn more about the world around us, we expand our knowledge and we change things. So we used to think there were 5 kingdoms, but based on better cellular evidence, biologists have now divided living organisms into 6 kingdoms. So let's look at each one of those. And to throw you off right from the start, I'm going to show you the first 2 kingdoms together. Formerly known as Kingdom Monera, the 2 kingdoms that are made up of bacteria, now divided into 2. We have the Archaeobacteria right here, and then we have the Eubacteria. Archaea, if we look at this first word, right, means ancient. Think about archaeology and what they study, ancient things. So the Archaeobacteria were the earliest life forms on Earth. And then Eubacteria, EU means, at the beginning of a word, means true. So they're kind of the true bacteria. But they have some really important things in common. One thing that all of the bacteria in both the Archaeobacteria and Eubacteria kingdoms have in common is that they are prokaryotic. As we discussed, prokaryotic organisms contain no nucleus or membrane-bound organelles. That's very important. The biggest difference between the 2 is what happens in their cell walls. So in the cell wall, you can see that Archaeobacteria, those earliest life forms, don't contain a substance known as peptidoglycan, and then Eubacteria do have peptidoglycan in their cell walls. So that's the biggest difference between the 2 kingdoms. But the most important thing for you to remember about both of these kingdoms is that they are prokaryotic. No nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles. So let's look at some examples. You hopefully recognize this picture, very similar to the one that you colored in for class, showing kind of your typical bacterium. And right here we have what some of the Archaeobacteria, those earliest life forms, look like. And then one of the ways that bacteria are classified is based on their shape. So you can see here we have the rod-shaped bacteria, we have circular bacteria, and then we have little spirally bacteria over here. So all of the Archaeobacteria and Eubacteria, 2 different kingdoms, are prokaryotes. Now our protists. Notice these are eukaryotic. So all of the other 4 kingdoms are made up of eukaryotic organisms. So that means they do contain a nucleus and those membrane-bound organelles. The protists, very far-ranging kingdom of organisms. They are mostly unicellular, okay, just like the prokaryotes. They consist typically of one-celled organisms. Some protists have cell walls, some don't. Depends on kind of how they branch out. Again, wide variety. And in terms of other structures, there's a very wide variety. So let's look at some different protists, which are, remember, eukaryotic. All right, so here are some of our eukaryotic protists. Right here, this is a euglena. Notice it has chloroplasts, precursor to plants. Same with this one down here, a volvox. Volvox is one of the colonial protists, so it's actually made up of cells, so all of these are different cells, that live together, but they aren't multicellular organisms. They're colonial. They might work together somewhat, but they are not dependent upon one another. They're not specialized like our cells. Down here in the lower left-hand corner is an amoeba. We talked about an amoeba once in class. It has a pseudopod, these things right here, those false feet that help them move. And then up here is a paramecium. Has a little oral groove here. Paramecium led to animals. One of the precursors or ancestors of animals eats bacteria and small protists. Next we have our fungi, the fungus, also eukaryotic. Mostly multicellular. Okay, mostly multicellular. There are some unicellular yeasts, for example. In the cell wall of fungi, we have a material called chitin. Chitin is a carbohydrate. Okay. But that's something that is important to know about fungi and their cell walls. Another important thing to note is that fungi do not contain chloroplasts. That means they are heterotrophs. Right? And if you don't remember what heterotrophs are, that means they are consumers. So they are not capable of making their own food through photosynthesis. So here showing a microscopic image of two fungi cells. Right here you can see the cell wall with the chitin. Then, when you think about fungi, you probably think about mushrooms, molds, yeast, mildew, all those kind of things that we kind of associate with gross things for some reason, maybe because fungi are decomposers. Next kingdom, plants or Plantae. Again, eukaryotic, multicellular. Plants are multicellular. Their cell walls contain cellulose. This is another carbohydrate. And what we typically think about, cellulose makes up cell walls. We're specifically talking about plant cell walls in this case. And plant cells do contain chloroplasts. That means they are autotrophs, self-feeders, or producers. So the chloroplasts allow plants to be able to go through photosynthesis, which we will talk about pretty soon. And here you can see the wide variety of plants, of course, Venus flytrap and huge redwood trees and wildflowers and cacti. All of these plants have different adaptations that help them survive. Here's a kind of typical plant cell. You colored one in very similar to this with a really large vacuole in the middle. And then over here, a microscopic image of a plant cell. All of these things are the chloroplasts in the plant cell, allowing the plants to go through photosynthesis. Our final kingdom, the one closest to our hearts, of course, is the animals. It's because that's what we are. Eukaryotic, multicellular, no cell walls. Our cells do not contain cell walls. Also, no chloroplasts. So again, all animals are heterotrophs. Okay? Now you might be wondering, what about protists? Are they heterotrophs? Are they autotrophs? And that depends. Remember, some of the protists had chloroplasts, they're autotrophic. Others do not contain chloroplasts, they're heterotrophic. So wide variety there. But back to our animals, no cell walls, but have all those other organelles, no chloroplasts. So let's look at some examples. All right, so we have our typical animal cell, similar to the one you colored in. This picture right here is showing some cells from the inside of a person's cheek. Okay. Here's a sea cucumber, just one of the funniest looking animals in my mind. Lives on the ocean floor, kind of looks like a cucumber as you can see, but it's heterotrophic, no cell walls, it is an animal. Here is common fruit fly, Drosophila melanogaster, which enabled so many different genetic studies and a lot of what we know about today, which is pretty cool. We had a frog. We'll be doing frog dissections at the end of the year. And then, of course, you all know Mr. Bernard. He's an animal too, just like you and me. So here's the whole table, kind of putting it all together. Probably want to have this written down in your notes. We will reference this many times throughout the year. So if you don't have it written down yet, pause, take a moment, get it in your notes. Once you've done that, good job. And this just shows kind of how they all fit together. So we have our archaebacteria and the eubacteria, right? So here are our prokaryotes, pro, before, and then carry, nucleus, so before the nucleus. And then up here, we have all of our eukaryotes. And you can see, hopefully, how bacteria, and then we get into protists. We'll talk about the theory as to how that happened later on this year. We talk about evolution, and then from our protists, that wide variety, we get the plants, you get the fungi, and you get the animals. So those are our 6 kingdoms on a cellular level.